This video will look at two historical examples which we can examine and compare to discover the realities of the state's monopoly of violence, the legitimation of or consent to rule, and how decision makers react when people under their charge are out of alignment with them. Two main examples chosen are just 11 years apart and occurred in neighbouring states in the USA, the Battle of Athens and the Little Rock Nine. But first we'll outline the concepts, define terms, and introduce a relevant thinker. In Germany 1919, during a time of political turmoil, political sociologist Max Weber made the assertion in his essay Politics as Vocation that a state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Note that territory is one of the characteristics of the state. Specifically at the present time, the right to use physical force is ascribed to other institutions, or to individuals only to the extent to which the state permits it. The state is considered the sole source of the right to use violence. Hence, politics for us means striving to share power or striving to influence the distribution of power, either among states or among groups within the state. So what happens politically in a liberal democracy when some people do not conform to the wishes of the state? As indeed the state, composed of a ruling elite or oligarchy, undeniably harbours wishes of its own, which can be at odds with the public. If it deems necessary, then these differences and ideas must be reconciled in one side's favour or blocked, and in doing so, the state has to act in a way that appears legitimate. In fact, more thought nowadays is put into this aspect than the bare mechanics of the actions undertaken, unless of course they are felt to affect the public reception that badly. Modern forms of state are the children of democracy, which abide the necessity to woo and organise the masses, and develop the utmost unity of direction and the strictest discipline. In all societies, two classes of people appear, a class that rules and a class that is ruled. The ruling class justifies its rule by some ideology. Where the state must use power, an individual or group is ultimately responsible for deciding to do so. This process in a liberal democracy is guided primarily by law, whereby the ruling class defines laws through the judiciary, with officers of the law then enforcing when citizens infract them. In a more local setting, particularly where the state hierarchy is broken into states or constituencies, Weber says, politicians outside the parliaments take the organisation in hand. That is to say that legitimate use of state power is not static, but dynamic, and requires the whole hierarchy to function correctly. Definable as per the estates of the realm, being the executive, the legislative branch, the judiciary, and the press, also known as the fourth estate. However, sovereign is he who decides on the exception, as Carl Schmitt reminds us, that ultimately the highest authority is not the on-the-ground enforcer of politics, but the individual or group who has the power to enact a state of exception, where the existing order is temporarily or otherwise suspended. The truest, greatest power is being able to make or break the rules, a power the state definitionally does not willingly lend to the people. After the conclusion of fighting in World War II, US servicemen were being demobilised and heading home, though there were those whose return was only temporarily for leave before having to finish non-combat duties overseas. Two of these men, who'd survived fighting in a world war, were on leave in their hometown of Athens, Tennessee, when forces from the corrupt local government shot and killed them both. With FDR's Democratic Party in power in the midst of war, Athens' local government had been able to get taken over by a Democrat as well in 1936, forming an oligarchy around banking, legislature, and the police. This political machine kept itself funded in part by wrongfully fining its residents and people travelling through the town, as well as the sheriff abusing expenses paid out based on the number of people jailed. In the decade of him being sheriff, these false expenses amounted to $300,000, $5 million in 2025, accounting for inflation. But their control came primarily from ballot boxes, which at every election would be watched closely, with people being coerced to vote in their favour. This and votes simply being falsified entirely. Poll tax receipts were also withheld from people so they couldn't legally vote, then sent out a day prior to the election just to be rescinded from people that actually received them in time, as well as political opponents. The sheriff and his deputies were akin to mafia enforcers, some actually having served time in prison before being deputized. These men of low character, who'd not fought in the war, took advantage of the good and capable men being away fighting to assert their control. In 1946, for the looming election, a group of returned veterans formed a GI-centric, non-partisan league to ensure there'd be a political alternative with votes being counted fairly and without coercion. A meeting comprised of only veterans solidified this effort, choosing their leader, who would be running to replace the corrupt sheriff, their slogan promising that your vote will be counted as cast. Come election day, and over 200 deputies had been drafted in to guard the ballot boxes, but the veterans also had a presence, and for the first time in a decade, the voters had the confidence to vote against the current regime. However, when it was noticed that people were voting against them, some were badly beaten, and in one case even shot dead. There had also been a firefight erupt at one of the polling stations. As the votes being counted were heavily against the current regime, the ballot boxes were taken and locked in the town jail, with many of the deputies garrisoning the building for protection from a baying mob led by the veterans. A single shot kicked off a firefight, which would escalate to the use of Molotov cocktails and explosives by the veterans, although remarkably nobody was killed by the time they'd gotten in and secured the ballots. Having counted them legitimately, the favour was for the veterans' man, over 15-1. The next day on, rapid reform was carried out that rid the town and the whole county of the corruption it had endured for over a decade. In 1954, the US Supreme Court issued the Brown v. Board of Education decision declaring segregated schools unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment, which says that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Following the decision, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People worked to enroll black students in formerly all-white schools across the South. In Little Rock, Arkansas, the school board agreed to comply and approved a plan of gradual integration submitted by the superintendent of schools the following year. Implementation was scheduled for the 1957 school year. Ahead of that school year, 9 black students were selected as a test by the NAACP to integrate into Little Rock Central High School based on academic performance and attendance scores. These would later become known as the Little Rock 9. When the term began at Central High School in September, the governor deployed the Arkansas National Guard to block the students' entry, citing possible threats of violence and public disorder. In response, President Eisenhower invoked the Insurrection Act of 1807 to authorize the use of federal troops for domestic law enforcement. On September 24th, Eisenhower ordered the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock and federalized the entire Arkansas National Guard, removing it from state control. At the request of the Department of Justice, black soldiers in the division were initially withheld from being deployed there. There were confrontations, resulting in only 2 injured locals, but the black students were nonetheless driven and escorted by dozens of armed soldiers from door to door. The motivation for this response was due to the international perception of the US and its democracy as part of the Cold War. Civil rights historian Mary Dujac argues that Eisenhower and federal officials prioritized international opinion in their response. The Secretary of State expressed alarm during a phone call with the Attorney General, warning that the crisis was ruining our foreign policy. He reviewed a draft of Eisenhower's public remarks on the incident and advised stronger emphasis on its international consequences. Supporting this perspective, Department of Justice briefs at the time cited only one justification for federal intervention, that racial segregation harmed US foreign relations. Discrimination was said to damage America's image abroad, particularly among decolonizing nations the US hoped to influence through policies like the Truman Doctrine of aiding new and democratic nations against communist influence. To counteract the negative image, the federal government launched a propaganda effort highlighting racial progress. One key example was The Negro in American Life, a booklet translated into 15 languages and distributed internationally, intended to counter Soviet criticism. It portrayed the US as a nation working toward racial equality through democratic means. In the introduction, I referenced Max Weber's definition of a state being a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. The American state, however, was founded with the belief that militias and arms were a necessity and right for a people to be free and able to overthrow tyrannical governance. In the case of Athens, then, by the federal government not punishing the veterans, they seemed to uphold those founding principles. However, in the case of Little Rock, they didn't blink before federalizing local troops and sending in the airborne with bayonets fixed, without anything like the coercion and violence that had triggered the veterans' retaliation against their corrupt sheriff. So the principle for the people or the state's use of force seems not to have been America's unique Second Amendment, something that went against the traditional definition of a state's powers as per Weber, but instead operated solely on the principle of legitimacy, as was part of Weber's definition. The American state claims not to have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, violence and arms, yet in all but this one case, it does. Think even of minor cases of self-defense, where a private citizen rightfully defends themselves against an unprovoked, intended to be deadly attack, but kills the attacker in the process. The legitimacy of their use of force still has to be decided by a state apparatus, that is, the judiciary, proving that ultimately still, despite the Second Amendment, the legitimate use of force is still monopolised by the state. It's top down. The decision on legitimacy may be from the very top, like with Eisenhower and Little Rock, in that case acting with a perceived pressure from Soviet propaganda and international relations strongly in mind. Or the same might happen to reach only so far up the hierarchy of power and responsibility, or be delegated down by higher-ups. With Athens, because the corrupt local government was in full control, they had no incentive to elevate the level of government involvement and thereby legitimacy, because they knew what they were doing was illegitimate. So, in an exceptional circumstance, when the people of the town rebelled, they did so in such an overwhelming and rapid way that the federal government wouldn't have been able to react if they'd have known and wanted to stop them anyway, at the time they'd won. Indeed, the media and federal government's response upon hearing of the situation was initially negative, clearly not wanting such armed mobs to take it upon themselves to overthrow their local governments across the country for perhaps lesser infractions. Though over time the story was rolled into myth regardless, and portrayed positively, with care, as if it were something to think fondly of but never again undergo, by politicians like Ronald Reagan. Myths are formed over time to suit narratives that serve points made by different administrations, allowing myths that contradict the state to endure thanks to the two-party system. On one hand, the 2A lobby will tout our first example, whereas the civil rights crowd will tout the second. The myth-making process has accelerated with technology and the normalization of the media industry working as propaganda, often blatantly partisan as with Fox and CNN. This is why the media industry creates such material as the Battle of Athens TV movie and the documentary filmed throughout the events at Little Rock. The popular imagination of these events, context, wraps like a blanket around the actual content, but not in a way that the people chose, but a small media or political elite. Opposed to the typical 2A and civil rights context for these examples, you could instead define and compare them like this. A whole county of white Americans, including veterans, in Athens, a town named after the birthplace of democracy, will have to fend for themselves against a corrupt local government, 10 years in the midst of war. Whereas 9 black students, being blocked from going to school in Little Rock, saw the president immediately invoke the Insurrection Act, federalize the National Guard, and deploy the airborne to suppress the majority local population who were against desegregated schools. While these myths, as they are intended to be remembered, command such power, there will never actually be any meaningful, successful action taken by the people versus the state. Because especially with a 2A, thinking this last resort can be taken and bring success means only that a people will find themselves kicked and beaten to the point of last resort before actually taking action, at which point success is incredibly unlikely. See the exceptional circumstances required for the Battle of Athens, where the sudden return of veterans from war through a sudden and localised escalation. But this example has never been repeated. Look instead to Little Rock for what happens in every other case when the state is at odds with the people. Then in an individual's case, take the killdozer even, also a veteran, held back by his local government for years, eventually snapped and went on a spree that drew the attention of thousands of armed law enforcement, ending with his suicide. A prime example of what is liable to happen when people fight back with force against the state as a means of last resort. It will simply never be deemed by the state as legitimate. The state will never consider itself tyrannical. Legitimacy also comes from moral claims. Weber says that no ethics in the world can dodge the fact that in numerous instances the attainment of good ends is bound to the fact that one must be willing to pay the price of using morally dubious means, or at least dangerous ones. This applies to both our main examples. Though focusing on Little Rock, President Eisenhower risked an immense danger if the angered locals fought back against the mobilized federal troops to guarantee their views about how their area should be run staying true. If they had hypothetically been the more powerful and organised force there, as with the veterans in Athens, they would have been the victors and been able to claim some moral legitimacy in using force for having achieved their purported moral end. This shows how might, more often than not, makes right. If your moral claim cannot be backed up with overwhelming violence, then it cannot be enforced. It simply remains a claim and nothing else. This explains why Eisenhower had to send in the army to demonstrate the willingness of the state to enforce its Brown v. Board of Education decision upon the whole country, as it was tied to the 14th Amendment and thereby a right of all citizens. Another German political scientist previously mentioned, Carl Schmitt, made the point that power in all forms of government is decisionist, defining the ultimate sovereignty laying with whoever is able to decide in the exception or decide in a state of exception that all law is situational law, and that the sovereign produces and guarantees the situation in its totality. He has the monopoly over this last decision. So while the judiciary may have determined the Brown v. Board of Education ruling, President Eisenhower decided not only to enforce that decision, but how. Power of decision remained either way at the very top of government, and without meaningful consultation from anyone outside of the state apparatus, as proven by the sending of troops to Little Rock. This reveals an inherent contradiction against the idealistic claims of liberal democracy to represent all people and allow all people to have an equal say. That at least politicians are given legitimation to rule by majority consent, voting. Yet outside of elections, people no longer have a say in the system, only elected and non-elected officials. The people will not have much of a say over their rulers until years later with another vote, where they're presented with no ability to decide on anything other than who to vote for. They've no true bottom-up policy proposal, for example. Schmitt concludes his thought on legal legitimacy with the line, "What matters for the reality of legal life is who decides." And in the case of Brown v. Board of Education, it was the 9 Chief Justices' unanimous agreement, made sure by particularly Chief Justice Warren. Note that these high legal positions are not staffed by elected officials, but are hand-picked by the President, then signed off by the Congress. So while they are placed by politicians elected by people, they are placed as partisans, not necessarily impartial, and not directly answerable to a voting public, who've no means of voting them out. The veracity of liberal democracy also falters in a less homogeneous society. As diversity increases in all ways, natural consensus decreases, and the need for an enforced, top-down false consensus becomes absolute. This is precisely what played out in Little Rock and throughout the Civil Rights era. Large areas where segregation had been the status quo for centuries now became forcefully desegregated, despite the wishes of those people who'd lived there all along. The ideal of self-governance and freedom of association particular to America had to be taken down in importance below enforced racial equality, as decided by the 9 Chief Justices and enforced by the President. All the while, a narrative has to be created to justify this decisionism as fitting into the legitimate process of liberal democracy. A narrative that hyper-focuses on certain things, like in this case staying true to the 14th Amendment, but entirely fails to acknowledge its contradictions. For example, how President Eisenhower had led a racially segregated US Army throughout the war, and how yet again he had sent in a racially segregated army of white soldiers only, despite the army having desegregated by law 9 years prior. Again, sovereign is he who decides in the exception. To recap, we've seen 2 dichotomous examples of the people versus state, that show from different angles the realities of the state's monopoly on violence the legitimation of or consent to rule, and how decision makers react when people under their charge are out of alignment with them. Myths are made that contain the real lessons, then used at the whim of different factions within the media and political elite to herd the masses. Legitimacy is manufactured and otherwise defaults to the state, as it holds the monopoly of violence de facto of being the state, regardless of its claim to citizens or states' rights. The main conclusion to draw from all of this is to be aware of it, not just in historical examples that are regurgitated in myth, but more importantly in the here and now. Don't be fooled by false narratives, and be harshly realistic about the powers and methods of the modern state. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned to Meta Britain.